An anonymous 5-second audio clip nearly shattered Jasmine Crockett's reputation and career. But with calm precision and every word weighed like steel, just 5 minutes later, she made veteran Chief Justice John Roberts admit, "I've been wrong for 30 years. The question is no longer whether Jasmine was right. It's this. How many others never got the chance to prove they were?" Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The wind howled through the stone steps of Summit Heights Federal Courthouse, sharp and merciless. Jasmine Crockett walked in alone. No lawyer, no staff, just a black coat and a folder clutched tightly in her hand. She looked like someone entering enemy territory, not a courtroom. Inside, every seat was filled, not for justice, but for a downfall. Reporters, senators, lobbyists, they weren't there to listen. They were there to watch her break. The cameras were already aimed at the defense table, lights harsh and unblinking. No one greeted her. No one smiled. In their eyes, the verdict was written before she spoke a word. But Jasmine didn't flinch, because she didn't come to be liked. She came to be heard. The room had barely settled after Jasmine took her seat when the sound hit, the long, hollow creak of the chamber doors opening. It wasn't loud, but it was commanding. Conversations halted. Pens stopped scratching. Even the photographers lowered their cameras for a moment, as if by instinct. And then he appeared. Chief Justice John Roberts. Every inch of his presence was engineered for control. His robe immaculately pressed, his gait slow but purposeful, his expression unreadable except for one thing. This was a man used to being the final word in every room he walked into. His footsteps echoed down the aisle with the calm menace of someone who didn't need to raise his voice to silence a crowd. It wasn't noise that gave him authority. It was the air he seemed to suck out of the room with every step. When he reached the bench, he paused, not because he needed to, but because he wanted the silence to stretch. His eyes moved methodically, scanning the courtroom like a general surveying a battlefield. Then they landed on Jasmine and stayed there. Something flickered across his face. Not anger, not disgust, but something colder. Recognition. Not of her as an equal, but as a disruption. The kind of voice he had spent a career outmaneuvering. A young black woman who had dared to speak clearly, without apology, in front of microphones he believed belonged to his world, not hers. He adjusted his glasses with 2 fingers, leaned forward slightly, and delivered the blow. Not shouted, but sharpened. "Ms. Crockett, this is a courtroom, not a stage for political theater." It was delivered like a punch wrapped in velvet, a smirk without a smile, and it landed exactly how he intended. The gallery responded instantly, chuckles at first, then a slow ripple of laughter, dry and deliberate, as if permission had just been granted to mock her. Some journalists glanced at one another, eyebrows raised, not because they were shocked, but because they'd been waiting for it. Others didn't even pretend to hide their amusement. It wasn't just disrespect, it was expectation. The room was still buzzing from the judge's remark when Elliot Drayton rose from his seat. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. Everything about his demeanor said one thing: control. His suit was flawlessly pressed, his silver tie pin catching just enough light to make him look important, but never flashy. He approached the center of the courtroom like it was a stage he had rehearsed on for years, and in truth he had. Elliot wasn't just a lawyer, he was a federal tactician, trained not only in law but in optics. He adjusted his cuffs, cleared his throat once, and began, voice calm and precise. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court," he said, turning to the jury with the confidence of someone who assumed belief would follow presence. "This isn't a case about freedom of speech. This is a case about power, about what happens when someone trusted to inform the public uses that trust to push a political message." He let that sink in, paced 2 steps, then turned sharply to face Jasmine. Ms. Crockett, standing at the official White House podium, looked into cameras watched by millions and said something no government official should ever say on the taxpayer's time. He walked to the prosecution table and picked up a document, pristine, tabbed, highlighted. On February 15th, these were her exact words: "They deserve it. Anyone who opposes America deserves what's coming." He paused, holding the silence like a weapon. Not a policy update, not a statistic. That is a threat. That is political aggression wrapped in patriotic language. The impact was immediate and visceral, a sharp intake of breath from the second row. Pens froze mid-word. One woman covered her mouth. In the back, a younger aide whispered something to a senior senator and nodded. A few journalists glanced at one another, their expressions a mix of intrigue and calculation. And somewhere, someone smirked. Because that was the moment they'd been waiting for. The quote that could be twisted into narrative, weaponized into guilt. Drayton knew that. He knew he didn't need context to win that moment. All he needed was momentum. He stepped forward again, slowly, directing the court's attention back to the highlighted text in his hand. This is not public service. This is not what we pay federal employees to do. That's not leadership, it's campaign talk. And we all know it. His tone sharpened, no longer cold but edged with moral outrage. The Hatch Act was written for this exact kind of abuse. Because when people in power use their position to shape public opinion for political gain, even subtly, it chips away at democracy. And if we don't call it out when we see it, we're saying it's okay. He turned back to the judge now, voice firm, clear. The law doesn't care what party she belongs to. It cares about action. And Ms. Crockett crossed the line. But Drayton wasn't finished. The quote had landed like a punch, but he was just getting started. He walked slowly back to the prosecution table, each step deliberate, his expression calm but calculated. He knew how to handle silence, how to stretch it, fill it, control it. Without a word, he opened his briefcase and reached inside. His hand came out holding a small silver USB drive. No label, no markings. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply turned toward the judge, held it up like a loaded weapon and said, "Your Honor, the prosecution has received an additional piece of evidence this morning, a recording, submitted anonymously. We don't know the source or the full chain of custody, but what we do know is that in this clip, Ms. Crockett can be clearly heard saying the same words you just heard in court. And even more than that," he paused, not because he forgot what to say, but because he wanted the words to settle into every ear, every notebook, every whispered conversation. "Same press briefing, off mic but clear," he added, unfiltered. Then he placed the drive on the evidence table like it was a live grenade. The moment hung in the air. Then it snapped. Gasps cut through the courtroom. Someone near the back actually said, "Oh my God," loud enough to be heard. Several jurors turned to one another, eyebrows raised, posture stiffening. A veteran journalist mouthed, "That's it." The judge leaned forward slightly, hands steepled. Reporters began scribbling. Some who had shown up to witness a fall from grace now looked convinced they were watching it in real time. The audio, now playing on courtroom speakers, captured Jasmine's voice saying, "They deserve it. Anyone who opposes America deserves what's coming, and maybe now they'll finally shut up and listen." It was her tone, measured, confident, unfiltered, that made it hit harder. There was no screaming, no sarcasm, just a quiet certainty that, played without context, sounded dangerously absolute. All at once, the entire room shifted. What had been doubt turned into suspicion. What started as political drama was beginning to feel more serious, more dangerous. Jasmine, still sitting at the defense table, could feel the air grow heavier around her, not just with tension, but with something worse, disbelief. She knew exactly how risky anonymous evidence could be. She knew how easily a 5-second audio clip, cut out of context, could be turned into a weapon. And in this courtroom, truth suddenly didn't matter as much as how the truth appeared. And the way it appeared was bad. Now every eye was on her, not because of what she said, but because, for the first time, it seemed like someone else was speaking on her behalf. But Jasmine didn't move, not to explain, not to protest. She sat still, hands calmly folded, as if the storm around her was happening in a different room. Her stillness wasn't surrender, it was discipline. She had seen this tactic before. Overwhelm, corner, then wait for the collapse. But she didn't give them the collapse. She gave them silence and let them sit in it. Until finally Judge Roberts looked up and said evenly, "Ms. Crockett, your response?" The moment snapped into slow motion. She stood, not quickly, not hesitantly, but with a kind of quiet gravity that pulled every eye toward her. Her shoulders square, chin high. She didn't clear her throat or adjust her blouse. She didn't shuffle papers or fidget. She simply stood there unflinching and waited until the room went completely still. Then she spoke, and her voice didn't rise. It didn't shake, and it didn't ask for permission. If this is a dress rehearsal for political theater, then the prosecution deserves a standing ovation. Truly, their timing, their drama, their delivery, it's flawless. She paused, not for effect, but for honesty. Then her tone cooled. But the only problem is, this isn't a theater, this is a courtroom, and I didn't come here to perform. I came here to deal in facts. That was it, just one breath of words, but it hit harder than the anonymous recording. Because Jasmine hadn't argued, she hadn't shouted, she hadn't begged, she'd simply clarified. And the effect was instant. The laughter stopped, the whispering halted. Even the judge leaned back slightly, as if re-evaluating her all over again. She didn't smile, she didn't gloat. She just stood in the silence she had created, and for the first time that morning, it was the prosecution, not the defense, who looked unsure. The silence she created didn't fade, it deepened. Jasmine took one slow breath and stepped forward, the folder still in her hands. But this time, it wasn't a shield, it was a scalpel. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began, her voice low but unmistakably firm. "We've heard accusations, we've seen headlines, we've even listened to an anonymous clip. But here's what we haven't done yet. Something basic, something essential. Read the actual law." She turned the folder outward, revealing a printed copy of the Hatch Act, bold text underlined and highlighted. "This is the statute the prosecution says I broke. It's short, clear. It says, a federal employee may not use their official authority or influence for the purpose of interfering with or affecting the result of an election." She looked at each juror as she repeated it, slowly, cleanly, not to criticize a trade policy, not to speak on camera, not to share federal data, only if the purpose is to influence an election. She took a step closer to the jury box, calm and measured. "Let's talk about February 15th, the day of that press briefing. Was there an election coming up? No. Were there campaign events underway? No. Did I tell anyone to vote for a candidate? Did I name a campaign? Ask for money? Issue an endorsement?" She shook her head, just once. "No, I stood at a podium, as part of my job, and answered a question about trade tariffs, using government-released numbers." She paused, letting the simplicity of that statement land. "I didn't hold a rally. I didn't push a slogan. I didn't say, vote Republican. I didn't say, support the president. I said our northern trade rivals were struggling under U.S. tariffs, which was true based on the Commerce Department's own findings. I said those who oppose American trade policy should expect consequences. And then I added a sentence that didn't make it into the prosecution's exhibit." Her voice didn't rise, but it gained weight. "I said, and I quote, but our job is to lead, not to gloat." The room shifted again, heads tilted. Pens hovered in the air. She wasn't speaking emotionally. She wasn't even angry. She was just right, and she knew it. "This case isn't about legality," she continued. "It's about discomfort. It's about tone. It's about the idea that someone like me, someone who speaks directly, someone who doesn't soften the truth, must be doing something wrong." She glanced toward the prosecution table, because when they couldn't find a donation, couldn't find a campaign, couldn't find a slogan, they found a tone they didn't like and called it illegal. She held up the law again. But the Hatch Act doesn't care about tone. It cares about action. It cares about intent. And if we start prosecuting based on how someone sounds, instead of what they actually did, then this courtroom isn't upholding the law. It's performing a trial of personality. Jasmine looked back to the jury now, both hands lowered at her sides. No theatrics, just one woman, standing alone, asking them to listen not with suspicion, but with reason. "You don't have to agree with my delivery, but I ask you to measure it against the law. The real law. The one written on this page. Not the one the headlines have imagined. Not the one the prosecution wishes it were. She paused, then added simply, because the difference between discomfort and illegality is everything. She let her previous words settle like dust in still air, then slowly returned to the defense table. Her movements were calm, methodical, deliberate. She opened the folder again, this time revealing a thicker document, about 10 pages, neatly printed, tabbed in yellow and blue with an official White House watermark on the corner. She held it up, not dramatically but clearly, and looked straight at the jury. What I'm holding, she said, is the full transcript of the press briefing in question, the one I delivered on February 15th. Not a clip, not an excerpt, the full record. Verified by the Office of Government Communications and archived by the National Press Database. She stepped forward, walking slowly toward the jury box as she handed a copy to the court clerk. You're going to see this with your own eyes, because I want you to see it. I need you to see it. Not because I'm asking for sympathy, but because this is how easily the truth gets twisted when someone wants to turn it into a weapon. She turned to the judge. Your Honor, I ask that page 3, line 14, be read aloud for the record. There was a pause. The courtroom waited. The clerk flipped through the pages. Then came the sentence, spoken clearly into the microphone. Some might say they deserve the economic consequences of opposing our trade policy, but our job is to lead, not to gloat. Jasmine stood still, then slowly turned back to face the jury. That's what I said, she continued, her voice calm but ironclad. That's the sentence they didn't include. That's the context they erased. The sentence that turned a political attack into a policy explanation. She raised her hand slightly, not to silence the room, but to draw its attention. I was asked a question about the effectiveness of tariffs. I answered with data, and I added a statement about responsibility, about restraint, about leadership. She paused, letting the words hang in the stillness. And what did they do with that? She asked. They took the middle of my answer, cut off the beginning, erased the ending, then held it up to the jury as if it were a smoking gun. Not because it was illegal, but because it was easy to manipulate. She now walked the length of the jury box, slowly, with a folded copy of the transcript in hand. I didn't break the law. I did my job. I briefed the press. I answered questions. I used facts that had been published by our own federal agencies. And yes, I spoke directly. I didn't sugarcoat. I didn't play soft. But I never, not once, asked for votes. I didn't name a candidate. I didn't say, support the president. I said we're leading a tough trade policy. I said it was working. And then I said the part that mattered most. Our job is to lead, not to gloat. Her voice didn't waver. It didn't need to. That line didn't fit their narrative, so they cut it out. She looked back at the prosecution table. They brought you 5 seconds. I brought you 5 pages. They brought you suspicion. I brought you a certified transcript. She held up the document again, not for drama, but for emphasis. If what I said was so damaging, why did they have to hide half of it? She gave the jurors just enough time to absorb the full transcript before turning toward the prosecution table and the USB drive still sitting there like a loaded trap. Her voice didn't change in volume, but it cooled in tone, gaining weight. Now, she said, walking slowly across the courtroom floor, let's talk about the audio file. The 5-second clip that was somehow dramatic enough to alter the mood of this entire courtroom. She stopped and looked directly at the jury, her voice precise and unshaking. You heard it. You saw how quickly everything turned. But no one has asked the most basic question yet. Where did it come from? She raised the official evidence log in her hand. Let me read what we know, she continued. It arrived in the prosecution's inbox at 7:14 a.m. this morning. No name, no return address, no affidavit, no timestamp metadata, no chain of custody, no indication of who recorded it, when it was recorded, or if it's even authentic. She lowered the paper slowly. It could have come from a bystander with a grudge. It could have been edited. It could have been fabricated. And yet it was played in this courtroom, treated like it carried the same weight as a sworn affidavit. She turned toward the judge now. Your Honor, in any other courtroom in this country, a piece of evidence without source, without verification, and without context would be thrown out before it touched the record. She glanced back toward the jury. But here, it's treated as a turning point. Then she walked forward, standing closer to the jurors than before, close enough to speak plainly as one citizen to another. Imagine someone accused you of a crime. Then imagine the only evidence was a 5-second voicemail. No date, no location, no witness to confirm it. Just 5 words cut in the middle of a sentence, played back with no explanation. Would you call that justice? She let the question hang, raw and rhetorical. No one moved. She looked each juror in the eye. Her voice dropped, not for effect, but for clarity. So let me ask it another way. When you take away the context, the authentication, the origin, when there's nothing left but 5 seconds of sound from a mystery source, what do we call that? She paused, let the room inhale, and delivered the final blow like a scalpel. Do we call it evidence? Or do we call it what it really is? A trap? The silence that followed wasn't confused. It wasn't tense. It was unnerved. Because in that moment, Jasmine had reframed everything. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't accused. She had simply asked the one question no one else had dared to say out loud. Is this about truth? Or is this about tactics? And suddenly, the burden wasn't just on her anymore. It was on the court. The room was still processing her last question when Jasmine stepped away from the jury. She didn't retreat to her table. She didn't pause to gather herself. Instead, she walked, slow, steady, deliberate, toward the front of the courtroom, toward the bench, toward the man whose silence had held more weight than any ruling yet spoken. She stopped just feet away from Chief Justice Roberts, and then she looked directly into his eyes. She didn't blink, didn't lower her gaze. Her voice, when it came, didn't tremble. It carried, low and sharp like a blade. Your Honor, she began, her tone controlled but unmistakably defiant. If an audio file with no author, no metadata, and no verification can be submitted as evidence, then this isn't a court of law. This is a stage, a political stage, dressed in robes and gavel, where suspicion replaces proof and perception replaces precedent. A ripple moved through the gallery, small but undeniable. A few heads turned. One juror shifted in their seat, but Jasmine didn't break eye contact with the judge. She let that moment hang in the air, not as a plea, but as a warning. Then slowly and without ceremony, she reached back into her folder and pulled out one final document. It was thinner than the others, only 2 pages. But she held it with the care of someone handling a live wire. She placed it on the edge of the podium and tapped once, softly. This, she said, is the ruling in Jenkins v. U.S. Civil Ethics Commission, 2018. A real case, a real precedent, and one this courtroom is dangerously close to violating. Her voice stayed level, but her pace quickened just slightly because now she wasn't defending herself. She was prosecuting the misuse of the law itself. In Jenkins, she continued, a federal employee was accused of violating the Hatch Act after speaking at a community event where the word leadership was interpreted as political endorsement. The Ethics Commission moved forward, the defense pushed back, and the court ruled unanimously that, in the absence of direct or demonstrable linkage to an election or candidate, expression of opinion alone does not constitute a violation of the Hatch Act. She let that sink in. No candidate mentioned. No election affected, no campaign promoted, and the court threw it out. Because the Hatch Act is not about tone, it's not about opinion, it's about influence over an electoral outcome. That's not just my argument, that's established law. Jasmine's tone darkened, not with anger, but with conviction. But instead of honoring that precedent, the prosecution clipped 5 seconds from a 20-minute briefing and called it a violation. And now they want this court to accept an anonymous recording, no source, no signature, as evidence. Why? Because it feels suspicious, because it sounds aggressive, because it looks bad. She stepped forward, closer to the bench now, still calm but visibly resolute. But courts do not rule on feelings. They rule on facts. They do not prosecute discomfort. They prosecute violations. And I refuse, respectfully, firmly, and unapologetically, to stand here and allow precedent to be ignored for the sake of political theater. The courtroom was dead silent. You could hear the faint buzz of a camera shutter and the subtle creak of someone shifting in the gallery. But no one spoke. No one dared. She leaned in, just slightly, and looked the judge square in the face. So I ask this court a final question. If the Hatch Act is to mean anything, shouldn't it be applied as written, as ruled? Or are we rewriting it here today, on the fly, because a 5-second clip made the wrong people uncomfortable? She didn't wait for a response. Instead, she turned back toward the gallery, then toward the jury box. You want to know what makes a real violation dangerous? She said, voice rising by only a fraction. It's not a strong opinion in a press room. It's bending the law around political optics. It's turning a courtroom into a PR event. It's accepting evidence that wouldn't pass basic journalistic standards, let alone legal ones. She pointed toward the USB drive again. If that's admissible, then none of us are safe. If that is enough to question someone's loyalty, someone's integrity, then every civil servant in this country is one clip sentence away from prosecution. A soft murmur broke out in the back rows. Not disrespectful, not dismissive, but something else entirely. Agreement, understanding, recognition, and Jasmine felt it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't move a muscle out of place. She just let the truth do what it always does when given room to breathe. It cut through noise like light through fog. Law doesn't belong to whoever shouts the loudest, she said, voice returning to a whisper. It belongs to those who uphold it, even when it's inconvenient. She took one final breath. And right now, I am not asking this court for sympathy. I am not asking to be liked. I am not even asking to be believed at face value. I'm asking for one thing, to be judged by the law, not by speculation, not by pressure, not by a whisper campaign wrapped in a flash drive. She stepped back finally, her arms lowered, her folder closed. And in that moment, for the first time since the trial had begun, the courtroom did not look at Jasmine as a defendant. They looked at her as a force, calm, grounded, in full command of the Constitution they were all sworn to uphold. And this time, even Chief Justice Roberts didn't have a word to say. The last words from Jasmine hadn't echoed. They had landed, heavy, unshakable. And then, silence. A silence so absolute it seemed to press against the walls of the courtroom like soundproof padding. No one moved. Not the reporters with pens frozen mid-sentence. Not the jurors with transcripts halfway turned. Not even the cameras, which had stopped clicking as if the room itself was holding its breath. The moment was brittle, fragile, like one false word could shatter it. Chief Justice Roberts leaned back in his chair slowly, his eyes never leaving Jasmine for a long beat. Then, without a word, he reached for the printed transcript she had submitted, the one marked in yellow and annotated in blue ink, the one the prosecution had conveniently summarized but never presented in full. He didn't scan it like a man looking for an excuse. He read it like someone reading it for the first time, not just with his eyes, but with a mind trying to catch up to something it had already dismissed. His fingers moved across the page slowly, pausing at the critical line. But our job is to lead, not to gloat. His brow tightened, not in anger, but in recognition. And for the first time all morning, the stern mask he wore began to show signs of wear. He adjusted his glasses, exhaled, and turned his attention across the aisle. Mr. Drayton, he said, softly, but with something harder underneath. Can you verify the origin of the audio clip submitted this morning? The question hit the prosecutor like a subtle strike to the ribs. Drayton, who had just an hour ago commanded the courtroom with flawless posture and courtroom charisma, now hesitated, just long enough for everyone to notice. He cleared his throat. Your Honor, we received the file from an anonymous source. That was all he said, but it was everything. There was no need for cross-examination, no need for raised voices or objections. The weight of what wasn't said, no source, no chain of custody, no confirmation, did all the damage for him. A ripple passed through the jury box and then through the gallery like a shifting wind. It wasn't drama. It was something colder. Realization. Chief Justice Roberts didn't speak right away. He didn't have to. His silence said more than any ruling. He leaned forward again, elbows on the bench, transcript still in hand, and looked back down. Not at Jasmine, not at Drayton, but at the words on the page in front of him. And you could see it, the recalibration, the reassessment, the shift from doubt to scrutiny, but not aimed at the defendant this time. Jasmine stood still, not triumphant, but rooted. Her hands were calm at her sides. She didn't smile. She didn't smirk, because she knew this wasn't a victory. It was clarity. She had forced the system to pause, to think, and sometimes that was louder than any declaration. Drayton tried to recover. While the source was anonymous, Your Honor, the contents of the audio, but Roberts raised one finger. Not a gesture of silence, just caution, precision, authority. That's enough, Mr. Drayton, he said, his voice sharper now. Let's not pretend what this court already knows. A file with no author, no validation, introduced on the morning of trial. He shook his head slowly. You're asking this court to treat hearsay as foundation. That's not how this works. Not here. The room had fallen into a silence so deep it felt physical, like a blanket laid over every breath. Even the ever-clicking cameras were still now, as if they understood instinctively that no sound should break what was coming. Chief Justice John Roberts remained still for a long moment, his fingertips pressed lightly against the edges of the bench, gaze resting not on the prosecution, not on the jury, but on Jasmine. She had returned to her seat, calm, still, not triumphant, but composed. She had not made a single gesture since she stepped back. Not a breath wasted, not a glance given to the crowd. She had said what needed to be said, and now she waited for the law to decide whether it still meant anything. Roberts finally shifted, slowly. He removed his glasses and placed them down beside the transcript on the bench. The gesture was small, but it sent a wave of anticipation across the courtroom. The man who had presided over dozens, maybe hundreds, of high-profile trials now looked heavier, not tired, but burdened, not by confusion, but by understanding. He leaned forward, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than expected. Lower, more personal. Ms. Crockett. He stopped, letting the words settle, then tried again. When this case was first assigned to my docket, I prepared myself to hear what I assumed would be a carefully managed political performance. I thought I'd be listening to a deflection, a reframe, perhaps even a calculated defense crafted more for public opinion than legal substance. Another pause. His eyes stayed on her. But you forced me to relearn my own understanding of the law I've been sworn to uphold for over 3 decades. No one moved. Not a breath escaped. Even the court clerk had stopped typing, hands hovering above the keys. Roberts reached again for the transcript and held it lightly in his fingers, like it carried the weight of something far greater than paper. You reminded this court, he continued, that the Hatch Act was not designed to police language, but to protect elections. It was written to prevent coercion, manipulation, the misuse of public office to influence democratic outcomes, not to punish public servants for delivering uncomfortable truths. He turned to face the courtroom now, not just the jury, but the entire room. His voice regained its judicial clarity, firmer, clearer. The prosecution's case relied heavily, if not entirely, on a short, isolated statement made during a legally sanctioned press briefing, a statement which, when viewed in full context, does not meet the threshold of unlawful political activity. The court finds no explicit endorsement, no implied campaign coordination, no misuse of authority for electoral influence. Then his voice cooled, and the next words landed like a stone dropped into water. Furthermore, the late submission of an audio clip of anonymous origin, lacking any verifiable chain of custody or metadata, does not satisfy the requirements for admissible evidence in federal court. There it was. It wasn't loud. It wasn't shouted. But it was the gavel drop before the gavel. Reporters looked at one another. Jurors subtly exhaled. Jasmine didn't move. Robert straightened slightly, now visibly finished with his internal debate. This court hereby rules that the submitted recording is inadmissible and that the defense, Ms. Jasmine Crockett, has not violated any provision of the Hatch Act. He leaned back in his chair. The decision had been rendered. The pressure had lifted. And yet, he wasn't done. His gaze returned to Jasmine one final time, not as a judge to a defendant, but as a man speaking to someone who had forced him to confront the rust on his own understanding of justice. "And one more thing, Ms. Crockett," he said, voice lower now, more personal again. "You've made me reconsider how I've interpreted this statute, not just today, but over the course of 30 years on this bench. You've reminded me that clarity is not always comfortable, and that truth doesn't always come from where we expect." Another pause. No one interrupted. No one dared to. "I came into this courtroom expecting to teach, but today I leave it having learned." He lifted the gavel, not quickly, not theatrically, and brought it down once with a single decisive bang. "This case is dismissed." For a moment the room did not erupt. It didn't know how. The silence that followed wasn't confused or relieved. It was reverent, as if something larger than a legal decision had just happened, as if they had just witnessed not a courtroom victory, but a recalibration of the justice system itself. And Jasmine? She didn't smile. She didn't pump a fist. She didn't look at the reporters scrambling to file their headlines or the aides whispering into phones. She reached down, quietly gathered her documents, closed the folder that had held her life for weeks, and stood. Straight, quiet, still. Because this moment wasn't about celebration. It was about proving something sacred could still be defended. And today she had done just that, with law, not volume, with facts, not fear. And with one final glance toward the empty center of the courtroom, she turned and walked away from the defense table, not as someone who had survived the process, but as someone who had redefined it. The gavel had fallen. The court was dismissed. But for several long seconds, no one stood. The room remained locked in that rare, sacred stillness that follows something irreversible. A verdict that didn't just close a case, but opened eyes. Jasmine didn't move right away. She stayed seated for one beat longer than expected. Not out of hesitation, but intention. She knew that this silence, the one she had earned through clarity, not combat, was worth honoring. Then with quiet certainty, she rose. No handshakes, no cheers, no legal team wrapping her in congratulations. Just her. The folder that had carried her defense now tucked under one arm, the same way she had carried it in. She walked toward the double doors, not with pride, but with purpose. Her heels echoed across the floor like punctuation. Behind her, the courtroom began to stir. Papers rustling, seats shifting, reporters whispering into microphones. But none of it touched her. The moment she stepped past the threshold and onto the granite steps of the courthouse, the chaos hit like a wave. "Ms. Crockett! Jasmine, over here! Can you confirm, was that an official rebuke of the Hatch Act?" The press had swarmed early. Satellite vans lined the curb. Camera lenses pointed like weapons. Journalists stood shoulder to shoulder, elbows locked, shouting over one another with questions that sounded more like accusations. Flashes erupted. Boom mics dangled. Live feeds rolled. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She stepped down slowly, her gaze forward, her spine unshaken by the noise. Reporters pushed in tighter, voices climbing over each other, and then one broke through clearly. "Ms. Crockett, would you call this a political victory?" Jasmine stopped. Just one step above the crowd, she turned, not quickly but with intent, and looked directly into the nearest camera lens. Her expression was unreadable. Not cold, not emotional, just firm, real. And then she answered. "No," she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade through silk. "This is not a political victory. This is a victory for principle." The crowd fell quiet for a moment, just long enough to hear it. She didn't elaborate. She didn't spin. She didn't repackage it for sound bites. She let those 10 words stand on their own, because they were enough, because they had to be. And then, just like that, she turned and kept walking. Not into a motorcade, not toward a podium, just forward, past the cameras, past the chaos, past the attempts to twist the truth she had just untangled. She didn't walk fast. She didn't need to. She had said everything she came to say in the courtroom, and again, right here. Now it was their turn to process it, their turn to catch up, their turn to answer the questions still echoing through their own headlines. Behind her, the reporters buzzed again, trying to parse the meaning of her answer, rushing to file their reactions, tweeting words like landmark, defiant, historic. But none of that was for her. She wasn't performing for cameras. She never had been. That was the part they still didn't understand. Because what had just happened wasn't made for politics. It was made for the record. One block away, the air was quieter. The noise didn't follow her. Not really. She paused at a crosswalk, looking up at the light. Not as a symbol, not as a metaphor, just as a person deciding whether to wait or walk. Someone across the street recognized her. A man in his 60s, suit jacket folded over one arm, briefcase in the other. He didn't call her name. He didn't take out a phone. He just nodded. Once, slow and deliberate. Jasmine nodded back. Just slightly. That was enough. By the time she reached the parking lot, the SUV was already waiting. A single staffer, one of the only people on her team who hadn't abandoned her when the indictment dropped, opened the rear door. "Are you okay?" the staffer asked gently. Jasmine didn't answer right away. She slid into the seat, set the folder beside her, and buckled her seatbelt. Then she looked out the window, not back toward the courthouse, but toward the horizon line beyond the city. "I'm not sure that's the right question," she finally said. The staffer hesitated. "Then what is?" Jasmine turned, her voice quieter now, but still unwavering. "The question isn't whether I'm okay. It's whether the system is." The staffer nodded slowly, then closed the door. Back inside the courthouse, Robert sat alone at the bench. The room had cleared, but he remained seated, still holding the now wrinkled transcript in his hands. He read it one more time. Not because he needed to, but because he couldn't quite believe how close they had come to rewriting the law based on tone, not action. He wasn't proud of the assumption he had made at the start, but he was grateful, quietly, heavily, that Jasmine Crockett had proven him wrong. Back at headquarters, newsrooms were already firing on all cylinders. "Clip her answer from the courthouse steps. Tag it with principle," one producer barked. "Get the Hatch Act ruling to our legal analysts," another snapped. "Is this precedent? Is the act outdated? Did a 33-year-old just teach the Chief Justice his own job?" Jasmine's face appeared across cable news banners. Not smiling, not waving, just still, facing the press, answering with that one line that didn't fit into any political box. This is a victory for principle. And suddenly people were listening, not just to her, but to the question behind her words. What does it mean when clarity is louder than power? What happens when the system expects a collapse and gets the Constitution instead? At that same hour, in homes across the country, retired veterans, civic teachers, former clerks, old reporters, watched the clip not once, but twice. Not because they didn't understand it the first time, but because they hadn't expected to hear it at all. And somewhere, one of them said quietly to his wife, "She didn't just win. She reminded them what the law's for." The wife nodded, blinking hard. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett sat in the back seat of a dark SUV. The city passed outside her window in flashes, concrete and glass and shadow. She said nothing. The staffer didn't interrupt, and the folder beside her remained closed. But inside her, the fire hadn't dimmed. It hadn't even cooled. It had just changed shape. Because this wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of a new kind of conversation, one where facts had to matter again, one where silence, when used right, could be stronger than the loudest lie, one where the law was a shield, not a stage. And Jasmine Crockett had made that clear, not by overpowering the court, but by reminding it what it was meant to protect. She hadn't said much when she walked out of that courthouse. Just 10 words. 10 calm, razor-edged words that no one saw coming. This is not a political victory. This is a victory for principle. But sometimes it only takes 10 words to ignite a fire. The clip hit social media less than 7 minutes after she left the steps. Someone caught the moment from a shaky phone cam, posted it raw, with no edits, no filters, just Jasmine Crockett, alone, surrounded by chaos, saying what the whole system had refused to say out loud. The caption read, "She didn't flinch. She didn't gloat. She told the truth." It started slow. A few hundred shares, a handful of comments, a few journalists on Twitter quoting the line with hashtags like #voice of reason and #Jasmine was right. But by nightfall, it was no longer just another clip in the churn of daily outrage. It had become something else entirely. Cable networks aired the footage in full, no interruptions, no spin, just her voice against the roar of reporters. Legal analysts, left, right, and center, paused their usual sound bites to say something they hadn't said in a long time. That was a masterclass in constitutional law. By the next morning, the hashtags had taken on lives of their own. Voice of reason trended across 4 continents. Modernize the Hatch Act surged as think tanks, law professors, and ethics commissions began revisiting case law in real time. And Jasmine was right. That one wasn't trending because of lawyers. It was trending because of people, teachers, veterans, nurses, factory workers, people who had been told their voice didn't matter and had just watched someone use hers like a scalpel against the very machinery that tried to crush her. Clips flooded TikTok, Instagram, X, and even corners of the internet usually immune to political noise. One showed Jasmine's final words to the judge overlaid with audio from JFK's inauguration. Another edited her turning from the microphones in slow motion with no music, just the sound of silence before a movement begins. But it wasn't just admiration, it was awakening. In comment sections beneath major media posts, users began asking questions no pundit had prepared for. What is the Hatch Act, exactly? Why does the law let tone be treated like proof? How many others have been silenced by rules that were never meant to punish clarity? And beneath those were thousands of variations of the same comment. I'm not political, but I know truth when I hear it. At a university law class in Boston, a professor scrapped his syllabus and played the full trial footage. He didn't ask them to analyze the ruling. He asked them to analyze her restraint. In a veterans hall in Fort Worth, an old sergeant stood up and told the room, "That woman didn't argue. She stood." That's what courage actually looks like. A high school civics teacher in Michigan asked his students to watch the clip, then write a 1-page response to the question, "What does principle mean when no one else is clapping?" But the most unexpected voice came from a place Jasmine never thought she'd reach. A retired federal judge from South Carolina, someone who had once publicly criticized her lack of decorum, wrote an op-ed titled, "I Misjudged Jasmine Crockett and the Law." In it, he wrote, "It is not often that one trial resets the compass, but this one did." And Ms. Crockett reminded us, some with robes and gavels included, that the purpose of law is not to protect comfort, it is to protect fairness. That op-ed alone was shared over 500,000 times in 3 days. Still, Jasmine never posted about the trial. No tweets, no interviews, no late-night monologues. She let the words she had already spoken continue doing their work, out in the open, where they were needed more than her presence. She wasn't interested in riding the wave. She was interested in making sure it didn't disappear when the headlines faded, because she knew what the system often forgot. Momentum is not change. Awareness is not reform, but clarity, sustained clarity, that's how laws get rewritten. And now, for the first time in decades, someone had made the country want to read the fine print. All because one woman refused to accept a distorted version of justice, and instead, line by line, page by page, sentence by steady sentence. She told the truth, and the truth caught fire. The hashtags hadn't faded. If anything, they had multiplied, spilling across platforms and timelines in ways no campaign manager, no media consultant, no partisan strategist could have predicted. People weren't just reposting Jasmine's word, they were owning them, repeating them at town halls, printing them on protest signs, quoting her in academic lectures and church sermons. This is a victory for principle. 10 words that somehow held the weight of a generation's frustration. But amid the storm of trending clips and cable punditry, One quiet envelope arrived at a downtown Washington office. Hand-addressed, stamped, no return email, no hashtag, just an old-fashioned letter. Inside was a single piece of paper, faded lines, neatly written in blue ink, a signature at the bottom, Thomas McAllister, U.S. Army retired, Fort Hood, Texas. Dear Ms. Crockett, I served in Vietnam in 1970. Lost 2 men in my platoon to an ambush we never saw coming. When I came home, I was told my fight was over. But lately, watching what's happened in this country, I wonder if it ever really ended. I've spent years watching people twist the flag into something it's not, watching the law used as a weapon, not a shield, and watching good people get steamrolled because they spoke too clearly for the comfort of those in power. But then I watched your trial, and I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Someone who stood alone, not to provoke, not to perform, but to protect something real. I once fought with a rifle. You fought with your mind, and you won. Thank you for reminding the rest of us what service still looks like. Respectfully, Sergeant Thomas McAllister, Ret. The staffer who opened the letter didn't speak for a full minute, just held it, then quietly slipped it into a protective sleeve and placed it in Jasmine's inbox. But that letter was more than a thank you. It was a signal. Because within days, professors were citing her arguments in constitutional law seminars. Civic organizations were requesting interviews, not with Jasmine, but with ethics scholars asking, can the Hatch Act still serve its purpose in an age of viral communication? And on Capitol Hill, the ripple hit harder than anyone expected. Senator Elena Ortega of Colorado stood on the Senate floor 3 days after the ruling with a printed copy of the trial transcript in her hand. She didn't shout. She didn't grandstand. She simply read aloud Jasmine's line from the stand. The Hatch Act wasn't written to police discomfort. It was written to protect the democratic process. Then she looked up and said, it's time we ask ourselves whether we're still using this law as it was intended, or whether we're using it to silence those who speak without fear. That one sentence made it into committee notes. By the following week, 3 state legislatures had introduced resolutions calling for a review of the Hatch Act's modern application. One called for a bipartisan ethics council to re-examine how influence is defined in the age of live streams and algorithms. Another cited Jenkins v. U.S. Civil Ethics Commission, the very precedent Jasmine had used, as proof that tone was becoming a substitute for action in too many investigations. Think tanks picked it up next. One released a 70-page brief titled, From Law to Leverage, The Chilling Effect of Over-Enforced Neutrality. The preface opened with a line that read, when truth becomes a liability, the law is no longer neutral. It is complicit. On college campuses, panels formed. Student moderators quoted Jasmine's arguments line by line, comparing her closing statements to historical moments like Barbara Jordan's Watergate address or Thurgood Marshall's Brown v. Board argument. They didn't compare content. They compared clarity. They saw in her not just brilliance, but precision, purpose, and restraint. But not all the reactions came from institutions. In living rooms, parents told their children, watch this. This is how you speak when the world expects you to flinch. In VFW halls, veterans replayed the clip with eyes that didn't blink, nodding quietly when Jasmine said, law doesn't belong to whoever shouts the loudest. And in barbershops and book clubs, town halls, and taxicabs, people began asking not just, what did she win, but what are we still getting wrong? Because Jasmine hadn't asked for reform. She hadn't demanded a rewrite. She had simply shown what happens when law is applied without bias and how rare that was becoming. And now a question had begun to echo, not as a partisan demand, but as a quiet collective challenge. Has the law outlived its language? Jasmine didn't reply to the veteran's letter right away. She read it 3 times before saying a word. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because some words need space to breathe. When she finally did respond, she wrote not from a podium or a press release, but by hand. Dear Sergeant McAllister, I've never carried a weapon, but I've felt the weight of being alone in a room that wanted me to disappear. What you did in the jungle, I will never pretend to understand. But what I tried to do in that courtroom wasn't win. It was protect something bigger than myself. Thank you for seeing that, and thank you for reminding me that even when the battles look different, The duty is the same, to hold the line. With respect, Jasmine Crockett. She never posted the letter, never mentioned it in interviews, but she kept it in her desk drawer. Because in the end, not every moment needed to go viral. Some victories are quiet, and some truths don't shout. They just stand their ground until the country starts listening. The headlines kept spinning. Op-eds, podcasts, primetime specials dissecting every second of her trial. Jasmine Crockett had not just walked out of a courtroom, she had walked into the bloodstream of a national reckoning. But for all the noise, all the applause, all the late-night segments quoting her word for word, she herself remained quiet. Not out of fear, not out of humility, but because she knew what the rest of the country was still struggling to realize. This was never about her. Not really. It was about what happens when the system expects you to fold, and instead, you hold the line. It was about what happens when the truth is inconvenient, unpolished, maybe even unpopular, but you speak it anyway. It was about what happens when you're alone, completely, because that's what the courtroom doesn't show you on camera. It doesn't show you what it feels like when you realize no one is coming to save you. No audience to applaud you, no legal army at your side, no social media team waiting backstage with talking points and a redemption arc. Just you. And the truth. Imagine that for a moment. Really imagine it. You're seated alone at the defense table. Every stare in the room is a loaded weapon. The judge already doubts you. The gallery came not to listen, but to watch you fall. And the people who once stood with you are suddenly, very publicly, silent. Your heart is thudding, not out of fear, but out of calculation. You know what's at stake. You know how quickly 5 seconds of audio can become a sentence. You know how easily clarity can be twisted into arrogance, and how often confidence in someone like you is mistaken for defiance. Now imagine the prosecutor plays a tape, an anonymous voice, 5 clipped seconds, no context, just static and suspicion and silence so loud it shakes the floor beneath you. Now imagine the judge looks at you. You have no script, no mentor, no legal team whispering strategy into your ear. Just a folder and a voice. What do? Do you lower your gaze? Do you wait for someone else to speak? Do you let the lie tighten its grip? Or do you stand? Do you walk forward, step by step, into the silence? Do you open that folder? Do you look that judge in the eye and say, I know what you expected of me, but I came here for the truth? That's what Jasmine did. That's what this story has always been about. Because this isn't just Jasmine's trial. This isn't just about a single courtroom, a single law, or a single piece of clipped evidence. This is about the country we say we are, and the laws we say we live by. It's about how easy it's become to prosecute clarity, to turn discomfort into guilt, to label facts as firebrands and treat directness as disruption. And most of all, it's about how few people are willing to step up when the room expects silence. You think you'll speak when the time comes? You think, when the lie lands at your feet and the crowd leans in, you'll be ready? You won't. Not unless you've prepared for that moment long before it arrives. Because Jasmine didn't win by improvising. She didn't survive by shouting louder. She didn't defend herself with emotion. She came in with the one thing they never expected: preparation wrapped in principle. Law weaponized with restraint. Clarity so sharp it didn't need volume. She walked into that room not just ready to speak, but ready to cut through noise with truth. So now the question's not, was she right? The question is, what would you have done if it were you at that table, with no team, no audience, no editor to fix your pauses, no audience to applaud your tone, just a transcript, a law written decades ago, and 5 seconds of audio that makes you sound like a traitor? Would you fold? Would you shout? Would you run? Or would you do what she did? Would you step forward, calm, clear, and tell the truth anyway? The camera pans away now, not from Jasmine, but toward you. Because this story, it turns out, was never just about her. It was always about the moment when the truth will come for you. When the system will ask, do you still believe in the law when it's inconvenient? Do you still speak clearly when clarity might cost you everything? Do you still show up when no one is watching? And when that moment comes, and it will you rise or will you stay seated? Because Jasmine Crockett didn't win because she had power. She didn't win because she had allies. She won because she had something no one could take from her: the truth and the courage to stand inside it. And now the question isn't about her anymore. It's about you. If tomorrow the seat at that table is yours, what will you bring? What will you say? And most importantly, will you rise? And as the dust settled, as the headlines faded, and the cameras turned to the next scandal, one question remained, whispered not by pundits or politicians, but by the people watching from the quiet corners of the country. What did we just witness? Because this wasn't just a legal victory. It wasn't about sound bites or political chess. This was a moment when the justice system, creaking under the weight of assumption, was forced to pause, to listen, to recalibrate. And at the center of it stood a woman who had every reason to walk away, but didn't. Jasmine Crockett faced down institutional doubt, anonymous sabotage, and centuries of coded silence. And she did it not with rage, not with applause behind her, but with the kind of quiet strength the law was built to protect. That's the human lesson buried beneath the courtroom tension. That truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks in alone, unarmed, and still holds the floor. That power, when left unchecked, expects surrender. It anticipates fear. It feeds off silence. But when met with unwavering clarity and unshakable principle, it stalls. It hesitates. It breaks. Jasmine didn't just remind us what the Hatch Act says. She reminded us why it exists. To guard against corruption, not criticism. To shield democracy, not weaponize discomfort. And in doing so, she reminded us that the law must be wielded carefully, or risk becoming a tool of suppression rather than protection. But the deeper truth, the one that lingers long after the transcript is filed and the gallery empties, is that courage is not situational. It's not something we find when we need it. It's something we build. And Jasmine built it long before she ever walked into that courtroom. She built it when no one was looking, when the pressure was quiet and the fear was loud. Her story isn't just a testament to legal brilliance. It's a blueprint for moral resilience, a reminder that justice doesn't demand perfection. It demands presence. It demands that someone stand, even when the floor shakes, even when the verdict is uncertain. So if there's a message here, it's this. You don't need a podium to make a point. You don't need a badge to defend what's right. Sometimes all you need is the truth and the will to carry it forward, even when the world looks away. Because justice isn't guaranteed. It's fought for, quietly, fiercely, one voice at a time. And sometimes all it takes is one person to hold that line. Just one. Just like her. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.